Good morning. Thank you, Nagshari. Brothers and sisters, and Mum. Thank you for indulging me in a family moment here. But I can't let this opportunity pass without, here I am standing up in front of everyone. So just to say how delighted I am that Vijaya Deepa, who is my mother, is here with us today. So, my talk. If you go on pilgrimage to India, you may well visit Rajgriha, the greatest city of the central Ganges basin, in the Buddha's time, and a place where he often stayed. You see the ring of mountains and that encircle the central plateau to create a natural fortress. But the city itself is covered with shrub and gorse, and whatever remains still is waiting to be excavated. There's much we don't know about the Buddha's world. But the Buddha didn't actually live in the city. Like other holy men, he dwelt in the mountains above it, especially on Vulture's peak. And you can walk up the steep path that he would have climbed every day as he returned from his begging round. And for the most part, you see what he would have seen. The vegetation gradually turns to scrub. Stark outcrops of rock loom above you, and rough caves hollow out the rock beneath. And then there's the atmosphere. It's intense, but hard to define. It's more harsh than tranquil. And you feel like an outsider who must speak quietly and walk carefully. You sense why people have long believed that phantoms and spirits, tormented spirits, populate those hills. The path winds up to a rocky clearing where the Buddha himself is said to have lived, taught, and meditated, while his followers found themselves ledges and hollows in the hills around. Now, in the Lotus Sutra's account, the air around Vulture's Peak is filled with Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But what you see is a spectacular view across the valley. Only a few pilgrims come here, and signs of modern life are scarce. So as you gaze out over the valley, it's easy to imagine that the noises of a long ruined city rise again through the air, that ochre-robed monks are meditating amid the rocks, and that Gautama Buddha is among them. My subject today is the Buddha of history, the man who lived and taught in places like Vulture's Peak. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha suggests that people with faith should bring him to mind by visiting places associated with his life. My own visits to Buddhist pilgrimage sites had that effect, but they also changed my view of the Buddha in ways I only appreciated some time later. The Buddha I'd envisaged till then combined an historical individual with a legendary sage and a transcendental archetype. Now, you can't separate these different images of the Buddha entirely, but my reflection is that overlaying them one on top of the other creates a hazy and blurred composite. Standing in the places where the Buddha stood and seeing the sights he himself saw reminded me that whatever other dimensions we may envisage, the Buddha was a real person made of real flesh and real blood. Writing my book on the Buddha took this much further. I'd been asked to write an historical biography, and I hoped that placing the Buddha in the distant past would make him more real and therefore bring him closer. That meant trying to enter his contemporaries' ways of thinking so I could understand better why he spoke to them as he did. And as I read the ancient texts, it meant trying to distinguish the voice of the genius who originated them and their remarkable insights from the sometimes ponderous form in which they're expressed. I need to say a little more about what I mean by the Buddha of history. In subsequent talks, we'll hear from Dhammadinna and Vulture about the Buddha of myth and the Buddha of reality. But we can distinguish several different versions of just the historical Buddha. For Mahayana Buddhists, the historical Buddha is Shakyamuni. People saw his Nirmanakaya form, but his true aspect, or a truer aspect, is the transcendental form, the Sambhogakaya form, who's better conceived not walking on the earth, but sitting on a lotus in the clear blue sky. Then there's Siddhartha, whose legendary life is related in the classical biographies and depicted in Buddhist art. Now, often when we retell stories of the Buddha's childhood in the palace, of the 4 sights that led him to leave home, and so on and so forth, we take them to be historical in the sense of things that actually happened. But in many of these cases, it's clear when you peruse the text and you see how the story is developed that these are legends that were added to the Buddha's biography. So we have Shakyamuni, we have Siddhartha, and the name Siddhartha is never mentioned in the Pali Canon, in the Discourses. There's nothing wrong with legends. Let me make this very clear. I'm not saying that history is better than legend or anything like that. Legends feed the emotions and they feed the imagination. But our culture, by which I suppose I mean Western culture or post-Enlightenment culture, in our culture, we've learned to distinguish between legend and history. And I think we must do the same. We must make that distinction. Now, we may well lament the loss of the imaginative and heroic dimension the legends evoke, but repudiating that modern approach to history also means refusing to respect the evidence on which it bases its conclusions. And we do so, I think, at the peril of our intellectual and even our moral integrity. What's more, the historical approach may in fact open up new ways of relating to the Buddha that are invisible to people who've grown up in a traditional society. It allows us to be much clearer about what the Buddha himself taught, in contrast to what others made of his teachings. So in practice, when we speak of the Buddha of history, we really mean the figure who appears in the discourses of the Sutta or Sutra Pitaka. You'll notice that I don't use the term Pali Canon because we've got other sources, other ways of knowing what was in the original Sutra Pitaka than just the Pali versions. What the archaeologists have unearthed tells us something about his society. There's nothing to what we can say about the Buddha's life or teachings. For information on these, we have only the texts. We know that the Pali Canon isn't a wholly reliable record of what the Buddha thought and did, so we need to read these texts critically and intelligently. But I believe the discourses do contain many words that come from the Buddha himself, even if they've been filtered, even if they've been translated. We can often see that certain elements have been worked up by scholastic monks or repackaged to aid memorization, but we're still left with an astonishingly original vision of reality. We're left with parables of genius. We're left with poetic richness, and we're even left with humour. No committee could ever devise these. They're the imprints of a great mind. None of the evidence for the historical Buddha is beyond dispute, but it does exist, and we should give it its due weight. It should shape and sometimes constrain our view of him. And disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, literary criticism, all of these really can help, if you're so minded, when we try to make sense of those things. But if we approach this material as Buddhists rather than historians, our aim won't just be to gain more accurate information. For me, the starting point of seeking the Buddha in history, whether through texts or pilgrimage, is to come close to him, or rather, to feel his closeness to us. So let us turn to those volumes of Buddhist scriptures that rest on our bookshelves, blowing the dust from them if necessary. I'll start by exploring the personality of the Buddha as it appears in the texts, then say something about his teachings, and finally consider how we can have a sense of the Buddha's awakening. I also have a few things to say about engaging with the Pali Canon. Now, Bhante Sangharakshita's advice for people approaching the Discourses is to begin with the most accessible volumes, the Udana, the Sutta Nipata, and the Dhammapada, which have the virtue of not only of being short, dramatic, and relatively light on doctrine, but also of being considered to be among the earliest texts. So let us start with a text from the Sutta Nipata that's been very important for me when it comes to catching the Buddha's voice and glimpsing his personality. This is the Attadanda Sutta, which is in the Sutta Nipata. It's sometimes called Taking Alms. So, the Attadanda Sutta starts with a dramatic statement about the nature of the world. Fear is born from arming oneself. Fear is born from arming oneself. Just see how many people fight. So immediately in this statement, fear is born from arming oneself. The Buddha has inverted the usual way of thinking, according to which people arm themselves because they're afraid. And Gautama, the Buddha, tells us that to explain what he means, he will share his personal experience. He says, I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. He's describing the state of mind that caused him to leave home and set out on his path to awakening. The pre-enlightenment book Gautama we encounter in texts like the Buddha Charita. That's one of the legendary versions of the Buddha's life that was written down several hundred years after he lived and died. This Gautama has been practicing Buddhist virtues for countless lifetimes already, and he's already virtually perfect. By contrast, the young Gautama of the Discourses is incomplete and highly emotional. He's shot through with this dreadful fear of the world's true nature as he's glimpsed it. So he continues, having seen people struggling and contending with each other like fish in a small amount of water, fear entered me. The world is everywhere insecure. Every direction is in turmoil. Desiring an abode for myself, I didn't find one uninhabited. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. Completely distraught. The first image captures the Buddha's experience of the world he knew as a youth. People struggle for space like writhing fish in a shrinking river. And that evokes a very different scene from the protected idyll of the legends. We can imagine this Gautama battling for his place among Shakya's competing nobles. Perhaps we sense the vulnerability of his nation, which, according to the traditional account, was destroyed at the end of his life in an orgy of ethnic cleansing. The Discourses never say that Gautama's father was a king, that his wife was called Yashodhara, that he saw 4 sights, or that he stole away from his wife and son in the middle of the night. Their account is simpler and starker. They speak of an intense awareness that people seek superficial pleasures and willfully blind themselves to old age, disease, and death, and of Gautama's intense wish to escape the common condition. Now, the most important point in the Attadanda Sutta comes next. So having had this vision of the world in conflict and turmoil, he says this: "Then I discerned here, he must be pointing to himself, a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions. So if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down." That's a powerful image. You look into your own heart and you see that you're wounded. It's a personal realization and a vision of the human condition that stayed with Gautama all his life. The cause of unhappiness lies in our own hearts. There's a thorn stuck in there. We can't even see it. We run in all directions. We don't realize that the fundamental cause is of our distress. But once we do see it, everything is different and suddenly clear. Now, right there, you have the first three noble truths: the fact of dukkha, its cause, and the possibility of its cessation. But here, in this sutta, these truths are expressed as this visceral image and an intense experience rather than through concepts. Now, I think that a very vivid and recognizable personality emerges through these lines. It's intense, it's passionate, determined, and fiercely individual. And a version of that character persists throughout Gautama's life, even once he's the Buddha. Now, on his way to enlightenment, Gautama is guided by a powerful urge to pull out the thorn, and he follows his intuition in deciding which approach will help him. In the end, he discards every practice he's offered and questions the underlying views that justify or mystify them. The dominant issue of his life is pulling out the thorn, and he rejects ideas about God, the soul, and the universe because they don't help. Instead, he does something that quite possibly no one else in human history has ever done before him. He looks intently at his own mind, at his experience, and finds a way to see how his mind is constantly shaping and reshaping itself. What one frequently ponders and dwells upon becomes the inclination of one's thought. He sees that his consciousness, the greatest given of all, arises and passes away in dependence upon conditions, and his experience is moulded by the skillful and unskillful mental states that arise in his mind, and he learns to guide his responses to those states. In that way, he becomes the master of his mind, and finally, as he sits beneath the Bodhi tree, he can remove the thorn. When he comes to teach, the Buddha's message addresses the same concerns: suffering and the end of suffering, how we distort reality in order to cope with existence, and how we can find a new way of being that accords with the impermanent, insubstantial way things really are. The Buddha directed his teaching at people who shared, to some degree at least, his sense that there's a thorn buried in their hearts, and that everyone else has one too, without realizing it. That insight explains the world because it explains ourselves. As I worked over the material that became my book, I saw I couldn't be objective about the Buddha because my own fundamental motivation in writing it, the reason I'm interested in the Buddha at all, is my own desire to go beyond confusion and unskillfulness and to help others do so. And that's a very personal thing. When I resonate with the Buddha's words in the Atthadanda Sutta, I feel I'm making a personal connection with him. So this is the great merit of seeking the Buddha in history. He was born as we are born, and he grew old, got ill, and felt pain, just as we do. He communicated his insights, whose minds were tangled up in views and attitudes that promised security but delivered suffering, just like ours. And he lived in a complex, violent and unjust society, just like ours, and had to find a creative response to its challenges. The Buddhist tradition hasn't really wanted to explore the subject of the Buddha's personality, because it's found it much more important to say that through his enlightenment, the Buddha became one with the Dharma, a reality that went beyond such things as personality. Also found it important to say that in becoming the Buddha attained this state of Buddhahood that had a cosmic significance that again went far beyond his mere humanity. And when we read the formal descriptions of the Buddha in the Discourses, what we encounter is lists of qualities that in fact would apply to any enlightened being, wonderful though they are, and they are largely removed from the qualities that we find in ordinary people. So whether that is an effective way of describing the Buddha for you or not, I think is quite a personal matter. For someone like me and for many of us, we've learned through reading novels, through watching plays, watching films, we've learned to identify with others through observing their behaviour and connecting with the distinctive character and personality that it expresses. So I think if we bring that sensibility to the Pali texts, we discover an individual and recognisably human dimension of the Buddha that I think has been there all the time. So, for example, the Discourses repeatedly describe Gautama's capacity to establish rapport. That's a relationship of mutual trust and emotional affinity with the people he met. At the end of his life, he actually talks about this in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. He says, I matched my appearance to their appearance, I matched the sound of my voice to theirs, and I instructed them with talk about the teaching, encouraging, enthusing, and inspiring them. The religious world in which the Buddha lived, the context for this, was in fact often tense and sometimes vicious. A Jain called Sachika sets off to debate with the Buddha, and he declares, we will draw the recluse Gautama into a dispute, pulling him about and dragging him about as a strong man, taking a sheep by its long fleece and holding it by the ears would shake it about. Well, unsurprisingly, Sachika doesn't get very far with that when it comes to the Buddha. Before you know it, there's a yaksha hovering above his head about to split his skull. Anyway, this is the world of the Buddha. We read of death threats and conspiracies, of fierce rivalries between the various groups of Shramanas who competed for lay support and royal patronage. They thought nothing of abusing each other. Rhetoric and browbeating filled their debates, and we even hear of religiously inspired murders and political infiltration of their groups. Some Shramanas mocked Gautama for keeping out of the debates. They said he was like a bison that circles around the herd but stays at the edge. He did agree to debate with people, however, if they came to see him, and there was some chance to manage the tone of the conversation. Now, his usual approach in the Discourses is to accept the terms on which a person thinks and speaks, so rather than challenging them from the outset. But then he infuses their way of thinking with a new meaning. So, for example, the Brahmin Sonadanda comes to visit the Buddha, worried that he won't be able to keep up with all of his abstract, intellectual, philosophical Shramana ideas. He's a Brahmin, he doesn't know about all of that. So the Buddha puts him at ease by asking him to describe the qualities of a true Brahmin. But then he leads Sonadanda step by step towards his own way of thinking, until Sonadanda agrees, and this absolutely dismays all of the other Brahmins in his entourage, that being a true Brahmin has nothing to do with birth, nothing to do with appearance, and nothing to do with knowledge of the sacred mantras. So then again, when the Buddha converses with an animal trainer, he speaks of training the mind. With a farmer, he uses agricultural metaphors. With those intent on union with Brahma, with God, he speaks of the Brahma Viharas. And he's directing his listeners each time to the qualities that they cherish rather than to the forms and the views with which they've become associated. He's afraid of no one and open to everyone, attending to no distinctions between individuals other than the inclination of their minds. Not caste, wealth, age, beauty, or intelligence. So all of this suggests a distinctive personality. The Buddha of the Mahayana Sutras convinces people through the power of his awakened mind or by engulfing them in radiance and so on. The Buddha of the Discourses, he also impresses people, but he persuades them through friendliness, through discussion, through communication. That's closer to home. What's more, he often fails to convince people. Disgruntled bhikkhus sometimes turn hostile, and even the faithful ones sometimes ignore him. And that's very close to home. Things that happen to us all the time, but never happen to an archetypal Buddha, also happen to Gautama. The archetypal version is perennially youthful. But Ananda turned one day to Gautama and said, "It's amazing, Lord. It's astounding how the Blessed One's complexion is no longer clear and bright. His limbs are flabby and wrinkled. His back bent forward. There's a discernible change in his faculties." And Gautama replies, Gautama's Jewish in this case, "That's the way it is, Ananda. What can you do? When young, one is subject to aging. When healthy, subject to illness. When alive, subject to death." Ay, ay, ay. The Discourses also portray the Buddha as a virtue of communication, who can adapt his words in 1,000 ways. He is, I think, a very considerable poet who can think in images and create whole streams of image thinking, as subtle and as complex as his concepts. The Uttadanda Sutta, for example, is a powerful poem. That image of fish in writhing around in a drying river prompts more water imagery when the Buddha tells us, "Greed, I say, is a great flood. It's a whirlpool, sucking one down, a constant yearning, seeking a hold, continually in movement. Difficult to cross is the morass of sensual desire." So we must live in the water where others jostle us for space, and we cannot find a place to stand. The stream flows through our minds, and eventually it will wash us away or engulf us. And this is just one image, one instance of the many water images in the Discourses. We must swim against the current until we feel firm ground beneath us. And then perhaps we find we've entered another stream that flows towards nirvana. A series of great images bind the Discourses together. The mind is a fire. The self is a house. An array of similes draws on the natural world and social life. The Buddha tells us irrigators draw off water, fletchers shape arrows, carpenters carve wood. The spiritually mature discipline themselves. And there we are, in the streets of Kapilavastu with the fascinated young Gautama observing the craftsman's intent concentration. And a seed is planted that will grow into the insight that if we learn another kind of skill, we can bring the craftsman's expertise to the rough material of our own minds. The Gautama of the Discourses is often kindly and sometimes stern. He's strongly motivated to share his insights with others, but he also loves solitude and the wandering life. And sometimes I think he seems divided between the two impulses. When things get too disturbing, too busy, he just walks off into the forest on his own without telling anyone where he's going. And Ananda, who's used to his ways, knows he doesn't want to be followed. When he's with monks, Gautama might sit quietly with them through the night. Or he might start talking about the Dharma in a way that expresses his ideas with an utter freshness, or knits together concepts that hitherto have seemed quite disparate and separate. He tells jokes. Now, the humour is often buried so deep beneath the discourse's sometimes ponderous surface, or else the jokes require so much explanation that you can hardly turn to the Pali Canon for belly laughs. But if we learn to recognise a distinctively wry tone, especially when the Buddha's, we can sometimes hear the humour, especially when the Buddha is poking fun at Brahmins, which he does quite a lot, or teasing the monks, which he does even more. Monks, suppose there was a beetle, a dung eater, full of dung, gorged with dung, with a huge pile of dung in front of him. He, because of that, would look down on other beetles and say, "Yippee, I'm a dung eater." In the same way, a certain monk goes into a village or town for alms. Having eaten as much as he likes, he goes to the monastery and, in the midst of a group of monks, boasts, "I've eaten as much as I like. I'm full of alms food and I've been invited again tomorrow." See, the Pali Canon just got a joke, got a laugh. That's pretty good, isn't it? So as I've spoken, you may have noticed I've gradually dropped the qualifications I mentioned earlier about the status and reliability of the texts and so on. And that's because, while we need to read intelligently, connecting with the Buddha is a matter of emotion. At some point, we need to set aside the qualifications and simply immerse ourselves in the text, loving them and loving the Buddha they describe. In any case, I think the qualities I've been describing these texts are the strongest argument for trusting them. If this figure isn't really the historical Buddha, then he must be one of the most remarkable literary characters ever created. No doubt monastic committees have redacted and bowdlerized the discourses, but I don't believe that any committee, even one made of arahants, was ever capable of so much subtlety and fecundity. Another thought may occur to you at this point. Is he really talking about the Pali Canon? These literary delights I'm evoking may seem to have little connection to the dread that fills one on seeing those PTS volumes lined up on a shelf, or finding oneself sinking in the quagmire of repetitions, or getting lost in those vast 2,000-page long books. I understand the difficulties, but I'm here to say that you can get beyond them. Or perhaps you don't feel that way. Perhaps you really love reading the Pali Canon. All the same, I think we can agree that engaging with the Canon is a daunting undertaking, and some guidance might help, so I have a few tips. Firstly, the short collections I mentioned earlier are a good starting point, and they repay considerable study. Difficulties come when we go beyond these and engage with the large collections, the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima, Samyutta, and Anguttara Nikayas. So we have in fact, English speakers are in a very fortunate position. For the first time ever, we have good, reliable, accessible translations of all of that material, with the exception of the Anguttara Nikaya, and we've got that one on the way. We've got two excellent anthologies, translated and selected by Bhikkhu Bodhi and Rupert Gethin. They're a very good place to start. But all the same, connecting with the material is a big jump. So my advice is, don't try to read it as if you're reading a novel. These aren't novels, you'll just get lost. A good approach is to take a book like mine, and there are others. There's many quotations and references and so on, and then follow up the references, follow up the sources, pursue threads, see what the original discourses have to say. But the main focus of the discourses isn't so much the Buddha as the teachings he gives. So if you really want to get into the Pali Canon, and if you want to connect with the Buddha, you need to get interested in the teachings, these teachings. And again, there are books. I did this with Analayo's book on Satipatthana, where I followed up the many, many references that he has. And that started to show me how to navigate all of those volumes. The Majjhima Nikaya, I just want to mention this in particular, I think is the heart of the canon. But you can get lost in it. So pick certain suttas. And if I've got a single suggestion about order study in this area, it's that we really focus on the Majjhima Nikaya, and that some of us work together to develop a body of commentaries on key discourses. So it is possible to engage with the Pali Canon, but you need to find your way into it. I think I might write some more about this later on. These teachings, the teachings we find in these discourses, are often detailed and rather technical, and that may well suggest that editors have been at work. Dreaded editors. Now, there's much that I could say about the teachings in general, but I just want to make one point today. It's well known that the Buddha refused to respond when asked whether the universe is finite or infinite, whether the soul and the body are the same or different, and what happens to the Tathagata after his death. But we don't always appreciate just how far the Buddha goes in refusing to engage in metaphysics at all. He is thoroughly pragmatic, focusing constantly on our experience, how it works, how it arises and passes away in dependence upon conditions. So yes, there are devas, yakshas and supernormal powers, presumably because these were all aspects of the world as the Buddha and other ancient Indians experienced it. But the Buddha's concern is how we relate to them, and the same principles apply as when we're dealing with any other aspect of experience. Craving and other unskillful tendencies separate us from the true nature of that experience. And the path means replacing them with skillful tendencies in every aspect of our lives, body, speech, and mind. These skillful states enable us to see and then inhabit the impermanent, insubstantial, dependently arisen reality that presents itself to us in every instant and which we constantly reject. Despite their cumbersome expression, all of those lists are an invitation to become interested in our minds and to learn how to change them. They describe how consciousness works, how it produces dukkha, and most importantly, how we can change our relationship to experience and free ourselves of the craving that is dukkha's cause. The Vipassana meditation practices the Buddha teaches, just to take one example, are his way of showing us how to dismantle the essential delusions of our lives, especially the delusion that we exist as fixed beings who are separate from the arising and ceasing of phenomena, and in that way to experience the world as the Buddha experienced it. So however technical and detailed the teachings are, they're the Buddha's attempt to show us his mind. All the meditation practices that he teaches introduce us to states of mind that the Buddha actually experienced and wanted to share. Subhuti made this point last night. Mindfulness, dhyana, metta, these are all experiences that he had access to, and he wanted to show us how to gain access to them ourselves. So approached like this, the scope of the teachings in the Canon is a source of wonder. So many different ways of seeing the mind. And then one sees the array of intricate metaphors and subtle parables that open one's mind to the truth that our experience arises in dependence upon conditions. Here's one I like. Once, monks, the Devas and Asuras were arrayed for battle. Now, in that battle, the Devas won. So the Devas of the 33 bound Vipachiti, the lord of the Asuras, neck, hand and foot, and brought him before Shaka. When the thought occurred to Vipachiti, the Devas are in the right and the Asuras in the wrong, I'm now going over to the city of the Devas, then he viewed himself as freed from that bond. The shackles fell off when he thought that way. But when the thought occurred to him, the Asuras are in the right and the Devas are in the wrong, I will go over to the city of the Asuras, then he viewed himself as bound. That's how subtle the bonds of Vipachiti were. But the bonds of Mara are even more subtle. So you have a kind of psychic tagging going on here. Distinctive vision of existence that we find in the Discourses and their mistrust of speculation and philosophy is the reason to make them the bedrock of our approach to the Dharma. They don't ask us to wrestle with contention that the mind is the only reality and that the outside world is a dream. There's no mention of a non-dual Dharmakaya beyond the world and no Buddha nature at the heart of experience. Not that there's anything wrong with those teachings, it's just worth knowing that they're not there in the early scriptures. I know that Bante's recent insistence on the early Buddhist tradition sounds to some people like a rejection of later Buddhism, and that would be especially troubling if you find particular inspiration or one or other aspect of the later traditions. But the best response I can think of is to cite Bante's work taken as a whole. Now, if Bante had wanted to reject the Mahayana, he would have become a mainstream Theravadan. Bante is intensely inspired by the Mahayana and by the Vajrayana, and he's communicated that enthusiasm to us. But his approach is integrative, about integrating, not eclectic or specific. He thinks that if we just pick and choose among the Buddhist traditions, our understanding and practice will be superficial, and if we just follow one of those traditions, it will be partial. So integrating the traditions means understanding what's at their core, the Dharma that was realized and taught by the Buddha. Far from cutting us off from later Buddhism, having these essential teachings as a foundation of our approach to the Dharma is precisely what allows us to engage with them. Then we can see when later traditions are creative re-expressions or helpful expansions of the tradition's core outlook, and when they contradict it. If a later teaching really does contradict an important aspect of what the Buddha said, or what he seems to have said, then a degree of caution is surely appropriate. Another point I'll add about what Bante is saying at the moment is all of this is depicted in visual form in the refuge tree. The Buddha is at the heart of it, and the other teachers we see in relation to the Buddha. So I don't think Bante is saying anything that he hasn't been saying for many years. Now, I've spoken of the value of approaching the Buddha historically to make him more vivid and recognizably human, and to illuminate the core teachings. All of this helps demystify both the Buddha and the Dharma, bringing them right down to earth and into our lives. But what about the Buddha's enlightenment? His otherness, the sense that he partakes of a different order of reality. Now, I could try to evoke this by quoting evocative passages from the scriptures, but I really don't know if that would actually bring us any closer to the Buddha. If the Buddha really was enlightened, as he claimed, the best we can hope for is a sense of his awakening somehow transpires through what we can observe his behaviour and through his ideas, his teachings and the practices that he taught. Asked if Gautama was wise, one of his disciples replied he didn't know, but he could deduce from Gautama's accomplishments his attainment by examining the external signs, just as an elephant tracker knows the dimensions of the beast he's following from the size of the footprints it leaves behind. That's what we're doing when we seek the Buddha in history. To get from the footprint to the elephant means imagining it. And that's what I was doing in writing my book. I was imagining, or even reimagining, the Buddha, while letting the evidence of the texts and history constrain and shape my imagination. As Subhuti said, we've all been making our own connections with the Buddha over the years through our practice. And historical approach can be part of that. First, we need to get to know the Buddha. And we can immerse ourselves in the great ocean of stories and teachings that are there in the Discourses. We can use our intelligence to discriminate the figure they describe. But as well as constraining the imagination, the ancient texts and the historical setting can fuel it. We need to read them with a willing mind and attune ourselves to their way of thinking and to a society that's probably very different from our own. And then we can relax in reflection or meditation and sense that the Buddha is sitting beside us. Having spent so much time getting to know the Buddha in the ways I've described, sometimes I find I can imagine his presence quite easily. I feel I'm connected with him. Sometimes I imagine the Buddha is alive in the world right now, and I ponder, how would he respond? What would he say if he was doing a Thought for the Day broadcast? Sometimes when I meditate, he's a large and friendly presence beside me. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel I'm connected to a mind that's as vast as the sky, and that with time and patience, my own timid, habit-ridden mind might find the courage to expand into its terrifying spaces. If we approach the Buddha in this spirit, perhaps the texts will cease to be dusty tomes and become the quietly stated words of a close friend and counsellor. If we visit Vulture's Peak or Bodh Gaya, a door may open and the far distant past be right here with us in this present moment. And if we're careful and patient and listen hard, we may feel the powerful presence of Gautama himself walking beside us and hear in his calm, vivid voice the reverberations of something beyond history, beyond texts, beyond personality, and the possibility of a new way of being in our own lives. Thank you.